I bring you greetings from the Cherokee Reservation, also something to celebrate. It is an interesting time in Indian country in the state of Oklahoma because there are, of course, tremendous amounts of information out there about reservations and what they mean, and tribes and what they mean and what they do. And it's getting exposure to a great many people in the state, in this region, in this country that previously may not have had much exposure to it. And that for Indian country is a good thing, because one of the things that we are up against is that many people just don't quite understand tribes. Now in Oklahoma, there's a much higher level of knowledge than in much of the rest of the country. But making sure people understand that tribes are here, have always been here, and will always be here is important to us, because we have, I think, so much to contribute, not only to our own tribal communities, but to all of our friends and neighbors. I get the opportunity to visit with a lot of young people, young natives who are in college or going on to job training, or maybe still in high school trying to explore what careers they want. I get the opportunity to visit, particularly with our career services staff, and some of them are here today, and I just really think they're the best in the business. And you get a sense here in 2022, when you think about the generation that's coming up, and then you think about the resources that Indian nations have, whether it's federal funds or whether it's, I don't know what the other tribes call it. We call them tribal funds or gen funds, but here's an easy way to think about it. The money we get when people lose at the casino, that's really a part of the funding source there. Let's just be plain about it. Our business is actually, and the other tribes are very diversified these days, so it's more than casinos. But money that we generate today is at a very high level. The budget of the Cherokee Nation this year is $3 billion. Now, a significant amount of that is federal funds, but a growing part of that are tribal funds. And if you look across Indian country, you see a lot of tribes that are having budgets that are increasing. And of course, budgets are about choices. They're about choices in how you spend those dollars. But if you think about where we are economically, where we are in terms of our tribal budgets, where we are in terms of the success of our businesses, which again are diversifying outside of gaming, although gaming continues to be strong. And then you look at political effectiveness, political might. There's nothing wrong with saying it, because tribes ought to have it and we need it. We've got interests to protect before the government of the United States, before the state of Oklahoma. But right now there is a feeling that tribes are in a strong position. And it's not strength that's been gained in recent months or recent years or even recent decades. It's not strength attributable to any particular Supreme Court case or change in federal Indian law. It's strength measured over centuries. This generation coming up, and there are a number of Native American students at this great institution and in institutions across the state and across the country that are dedicated to education, whether it's higher education, whether it's a career, tech training, or other types of learning. There is a sense that this generation coming up has the best shot of any generation in about 5 centuries, not 5 years, not 50 years, 5 centuries, to be Native Americans that can look ahead to their future personally and look to their future collectively as citizens of their respective tribes and feel tremendous confidence, can feel like their nations, their tribes are going to still be here when they reach the end of their careers, when they reach their golden years. Because in the centuries before and in the generations before, this is what Native Americans had to face. Whether as a people we would still exist, maybe as individuals we would exist, but would we still exist as a people? And this is where context is incredibly important when you're understanding and growing to understand and gaining exposure to any sort of information or news about Indian country or about tribes. Context is critical. Think about the Cherokee Nation, and you can think about the other tribes in Oklahoma. In the last 40 years, we have been on a steady march of progress in the tribes. But go back further than that. We just this morning welcomed back the Remember the Removal bike riders to our capital in Tahlequah. This is a group of young people who retrace the Trail of Tears, who retrace our forced removal in the 19th century. Now, Cherokees call it the Trail of Tears, but you can go across Indian country and you can find many trails of tears. You can find many instances in which the government of the United States believed they had an Indian problem, and the way to solve that problem was to wipe Native Americans away, to erase lines on a map, to go back on treaty promises. In the case of Cherokees, and this is true of other tribes, I don't want to suggest this is just a Cherokee experience, but to round a people up into stockades for a forced removal to a new land. This is the story of the relationship between the United States and Native peoples for so much of the history of this country, and it's a history that ought to be told and it ought to be understood. It's not the entirety of the story, but it's an important part of the story. So think about those generations of young Native Americans. Think about a young person who was Cherokee in 1838, and instead of thinking ahead to their future and their family's future and how their tribe had prospered in just a few decades by becoming a literate people, by changing its form of government, by strengthening itself against the encroachment of settlers and people who wanted our resources. But think about those young people who were not staring into the future with hope and optimism, but were staring at a bayonet from a federal soldier who was rounding them and their families up in stockades. That happened in this country just less than 2 centuries ago. So that's an example of one generation of Native peoples, and I haven't even gone back to European contact. That's what I mean when I say 5 centuries. Just 2 centuries ago, think about those young people and the desperation and the lack of hope and the belief that the best days for the Cherokee Nation, or name the tribe, the best days of their tribe were behind them, not ahead of them. Whether they would survive was one thing, whether their people would survive quite another. And then go forward a bit further. I mean, the Cherokee people and the other Native peoples that were relocated to Oklahoma did something that is not well known and understood or taught, but is remarkable. You would think the people that were forcibly removed had their political system ripped apart, had their democracy crushed, lost a quarter of their population. You would think that that group of people, and I'm talking about Cherokees, but you could apply this to so many of our Native brothers and sisters, you would think it would take generations to rebuild if they could rebuild at all, and the Cherokee people rebuilt within a short period of time, within a matter of years, within a decade. We invested in things that would make us whole. We invested in things that would give this young generation coming up great hope. What did we invest in? What did we do? We had to put our democracy back together. So yes, we invested in a government that was built on the rule of law. We had to build ourselves up economically. So yes, we invested in what in the 19th century would pass for infrastructure, some roads, some bringing communities together. But the thing we spent the most money on, of that limited treasure we had left, was education for every single of our fellow Cherokees, for every single one of them. We built the first institution of higher learning for any woman of any race west of the Mississippi after our removal, and we know it today as Northeastern State University. We founded a system of public education, free public education, in what would become the state of Oklahoma before anyone ever heard of an Oklahoma. So we were doing things that were important to us then to sort of build up hope and optimism and to create an opportunity for young people, young natives, to look into the future and say, there is hope for me personally and there's hope for my people. But even with all of that, at the turn of the 20th century, when the state of Oklahoma is imposed over tribal lands, young people like my grandfather, and I think about him a lot when I'm in this position that I hold as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, most of his life, his experience was the experience of Native peoples in the 20th century. Most of his life, he wasn't allowed to vote for his own chief. I can't imagine that he ever thought his grandson would be the chief. But my grandfather and people in his generation also looked into the future and may have seen a role for them in society. But they would have had plenty of reason to doubt that there would be a future for the Cherokee Nation, which in the 20th century had once again been nearly dismantled, nearly eliminated, because the policy of the government of the United States was that we still had an Indian problem in this country. There were politicians and elected officials that once again believed that our sovereignty and the sovereignty of other Indian nations was a threat. So that was the experience of his generation. It's only been, my friends, in the last 40 years that we've had a change in federal Indian policy in this country that has said that the United States ought to take its boot off the necks of Indian tribes, and I don't know a nice way to say that because that's the truth. If the United States would take its boot off the necks of Indian tribes and let us self-govern, let us exercise sovereignty and understand that sovereignty is not a threat, sovereignty is an opportunity for Native peoples. What we've been doing in the last 40 years is, I think, showing the world that when Native peoples get to exercise the God-given right to self-identify and to govern ourselves, we do extraordinary things collectively. And what we're doing now in the Cherokee Nation really harkens back to that time in the 19th century when we were desperate and needed to rebuild, and we put so much of our resources into the public good, into education. We're doing it again. That's where our partnerships with education institutions, with industry, with OSUIT are just absolutely indispensable. We want to create a world, and I think we ought to create a world in which young natives growing up have this sense of hope and optimism for themselves personally, that they can get a career and make a living and stay in the communities where they have grown up and maybe where their family has lived for generations. And they ought to have this sense that their tribe's existence is not in jeopardy. That's what we want for young natives. And that's why I say today, in 2022, the young generation coming up has a shot at that like no generation before them for 5 centuries. It really does matter whether we put resources into higher education and career tech education. It really matters to those big existential questions about whether there's going to be a Cherokee Nation in a few generations. Because if we don't invest in our people today, when it comes to getting a good job, that means that too many of them will leave their communities. That means that those communities where our lifeways are still held dear and our language is still spoken and our traditions are still there, that means those communities wither on the vine. That means that people move away as they did in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. They leave tribes for economic opportunity. We want them to stay here. And working with this institution is actually one way to do that. I know your mission is to ready people for careers, but I want you to know that working with tribes means you're doing something that I think is so much more enormous than that, as big as that is, because it's really about the role of tribes in the next century, in the next generation, and whether we're going to keep our foothold or whether we're going to continue to build strong. That's why I take what we do at the Cherokee Nation so serious when it comes to career training. Now, I went to college, and college was right for me. My father eventually went to college, and college was right for him. But right before I took office in 2019, he came to me. My father was a member of the legislature. He was a school teacher. He was a member of our legislative branch in the council. He worked for my predecessor, Chief Bill John Baker. He knew what he was talking about, and he valued higher education. He valued a college degree. But he told me, son, do not forget where you came from. Do not forget that your grandfather, that gentleman I mentioned a while ago, that full-blood Cherokee, Sam Hoskin, as proud of Cherokee as you'd ever know, but a man who never got to vote for the chief of the Cherokee Nation and never imagined his grandson would be chief, was an iron worker. He was an iron worker that got his skills through Local 584 in Tulsa, and he earned a good living for his family. And my father reminded me that before he went on to get his degree in education that he had to work his way through that, and he was a letter carrier for a while, and before that he was an iron worker. And he told me and reminded me about all the people who've impacted my life, whether it's professionally or personally, that got their foothold in the economy because they got a chance to earn a skill and it was somewhere outside of a college. Those things are important. So Deputy Chief Brian Warner and I proposed what we call the Career Readiness Act in 2019. We wanted to double what we were spending on career education from those tribal funds. Remember those funds when you lose at the casino? We wanted to double that for career tech. So it all comes back here. Don't worry about it, folks. It comes back here. But we wanted to double that because we didn't feel like we were making the commitment we might make to send somebody to trade school, to send somebody to career tech, to do those things we ought to do to fill every one of our people with a sense of optimism about themselves personally and about their tribe. So we doubled that. What that meant was $2 million instead of $1 million. And I have to say, in the age of ARPA dollars and our companies becoming more and more profitable in just a short period of time, that seems like a relatively small amount of money. But it was more than what that money represented. It was about the commitment. It was about the message that we sent to our people that just because you don't want a traditional college career path, that your government has your back. And that's the message we need to send to young people, is that we know you want to work. We know you want to get ahead. We know you want to get knowledge. We know you want to get skills, and you've got a government that will have your back. That's what we ought to do in this country. That's what we ought to do in this state. And that's what we are doing at the Cherokee Nation. And we hope that's creating opportunities for a lot more young people in particular than before we enacted that measure in 2019. And then when we received some additional federal dollars under the CARES Act, we put $7 million behind that same effort. And under the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, look, we could do a lot of things with those dollars. And we get ideas every day from our citizens about what we ought to be doing with those dollars. And we try to implement those ideas. But we were committed to doing even more to send people at no cost to institutions like OSUIT or any of the career techs across the reservation. So we put $29 million into that effort. So going from doubling what we're doing and saying that was $2 million, and that was an historic effort, to now putting $29 million over the next 3 years, I think it's going to make an enormous impact. It's going to mean that a young person, or even a not so young person that might be displaced by the economy, might need to change careers, or might be out of the workforce for any number of reasons and feels like they don't have hope, don't have a way to get a foothold in the economy, we think these dollars can make a difference. We think it's something bigger than that. We also think this is how we instill optimism collectively in our people. We want every one of our people that are able-bodied and able to work and ready to work to be able to find a job and stay home and get training to do that work. We want as many Native Americans of any tribe in all of these professions. We want to be represented. We want our young people to see themselves in every profession, in every community, in every city around this country. And the only way we're going to do that is to give people a shot at an education. If there's something to be built, we want a Native American building it. If there is care that needs to be provided to people in need, whether it's health care, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's any form of public safety, we want a Native American to be providing that care. If there's a new technology that needs to be harnessed so that we can do more in this country in terms of production or in terms of innovation, we want a Native American on the front lines of that. The only way we're going to do it is to understand that we have a collective interest in the education of our people, that it's not every man for himself, that we're all in it together. And this is one way that we show it. So when I heard about the opportunity to come to OSUIT, and I heard that you all were having a convening of tribes to talk about career readiness, I knew I needed to be here because this is so near and dear to my heart. And what you do is near and dear to my heart. But more than anything, I wanted to share with you not the statistics we have. I know we have thousands of people that have been affected by this. We have a lineman training program that's getting people into good jobs. I could talk to you about that. I can talk to you about the new career center we're going to build in Tahlequah. Those are all important. We've got the best career services staff, and they can share that information with you. But what I want you to know is that what you do here, partnering with us, is about something that really goes to the core of what it means to be Native American. It really goes to this idea that this generation coming up needs to be a generation full of optimism and hope and the ability to earn a living and the understanding that their people have always been here and we will always be here. Creator willing, we will always be here. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you all. Whatever.